The night my mother-in-law came home with a man none of us had ever seen, she walked in like she owned every inch of the silence that followed. I was standing in the kitchen finishing the dishes when I heard the front door open. It was a Tuesday. Diane never came home on Tuesdays without calling first. That was just who she was, a woman of habits so fixed you could set a clock by them. So when I heard two sets of footsteps instead of one, I turned off the faucet and stood very still. "Claire?" she called out, and her voice had something in it I couldn't name. Not nervousness exactly. Closer to the way someone sounds when they've already made a decision and they're just waiting for you to catch up. I dried my hands and walked to the living room. He was standing next to her by the door, holding her hand. He looked maybe 32, 33 at most, dark hair, clean-shaven, wearing a button-down that was too crisp for a Tuesday evening. Diane was 64. She had a good life, a beautiful home in Naperville, and until that moment, I would have described her as one of the most sensible people I'd ever met. "This is Marcus," she said. "We got married last weekend in Lake Geneva." I remember the exact feeling. It was like stepping off a curb you didn't know was there. That half-second drop in your stomach before the ground comes up to meet you. My husband Daniel was in the garage. I didn't say anything. I just stood there looking at Marcus, who looked back at me with an expression that was either very calm or very practiced. I still don't know which. Daniel took it worse than I did. He came inside maybe 20 minutes later, smelled like motor oil, was about to say something about dinner, and then stopped when he saw Marcus sitting on the couch in his mother's living room with his shoes off like he lived there. Because, as it turned out, he did. "Mom." Daniel said it like a whole sentence. Diane explained again. "Lake Geneva. Last Saturday. Small ceremony. Very private." She was smiling the way people smile when they're braced for impact. What followed was the kind of conversation that no one handles well. Daniel's voice stayed controlled for about 4 minutes and then climbed. He said things like, "You don't even know him, and what were you thinking?" And at one point, "Mom, he's younger than I am," which was true. Marcus was 31. Daniel was 35. Marcus sat through the whole thing quietly. He didn't defend himself. He didn't get angry. He'd just sat there with his hands folded in his lap and waited. Like he'd already been through this in his head 100 times and had decided it wasn't worth engaging. That bothered me more than anything else he could have done. After Daniel stormed out to call his sister, I found myself alone in the kitchen with Marcus for about 90 seconds. I asked him if he wanted water. He said yes. I handed him a glass and he said, "I know this is a shock." I said, "Yeah, it is." And that was all. But I watched him when he didn't know I was watching, and there was something behind his eyes that I couldn't read. Not guilt, not anxiety, something more like patience. Like a man who was waiting for something to be over. I thought about that look for a long time afterward. Daniel's sister was Rebecca. She drove up from the city the following Saturday with her fiancé and a list of questions that she'd apparently typed up on her phone during the drive. Rebecca was an attorney. She had a gift for making conversations feel like depositions. The 6 of us sat in Diane's dining room, and it was supposed to be civil. For about 15 minutes it was. Rebecca wanted to know when they'd met. Diane said 8 months ago, at a continuing education class she was taking at the community college, watercolor painting. Marcus had been the instructor. She said it plainly, like it didn't sound like anything, and maybe to her it didn't. Rebecca wrote something in her notes. I watched Marcus across the table and he was looking at Diane, not at Rebecca. There was something gentle in it. Something I hadn't expected. Then Rebecca asked about a prenuptial agreement. Diane said there wasn't one. The temperature in the room dropped about 10 degrees. Diane owned the house outright. She had retirement accounts from 31 years as a hospital administrator. She had an investment portfolio that Daniel and Rebecca had grown up, knowing existed, but never knowing the exact number. She was not a wealthy woman by any extreme measure, but she was comfortable. And she had worked for every cent of it. And now she was sitting across from her children, telling them she had married a 31-year-old watercolor instructor without a prenuptial agreement, and seemed genuinely puzzled by why anyone would have a problem with that. Rebecca kept her voice even. I will give her that. But after the dinner, when Daniel and I were driving home, he said, "Something is wrong, Claire." And I didn't argue. Because I felt it too. I just didn't know yet what it was. The first time I noticed something was off wasn't the marriage. It was the door. Diane's house had a guest room at the end of the hall on the 2nd floor. It was the room where Daniel had grown up, where Rebecca used to sleep on visits, where their dad's old fishing gear was still in boxes in the closet. A nothing room. A regular room. 3 weeks after the wedding, Daniel and I went over for Sunday dinner, and that door was closed. Not unusual on its own. But it was locked. I walked past it to use the bathroom and tried the handle without thinking, the way you do, and it didn't turn. I didn't mention it. The next Sunday, it was locked again. And this time, when I was setting the table, I heard something, very faint, through the wall that the dining room shared with that hallway. A sound I couldn't identify at first, low and rhythmic. Like someone shifting furniture. Or pacing. I told Daniel that night. He said I was imagining things. I said, I'm not. Go back next weekend and pay attention. He did. And he heard it too. By week 5, whatever was in that room had become the thing none of us talked about at dinner, but all of us were thinking about. We weren't there every Sunday anymore. Diane had started making excuses, saying she was tired, that Marcus had plans, that the drive was too long for us. But Daniel's aunt, Patrice, who lived 3 streets over and had a key, mentioned to Daniel that she'd knocked one afternoon and thought she heard something upstairs. She'd called Diane's name, and Diane had come to the door too quickly, a little breathless, and said everything was fine in a way that Patrice said didn't sound fine at all. Daniel called Diane directly. He asked her what was in the guest's room. She said, storage. He said, storage doesn't pace. Silence for a moment. Then she said, Daniel, I need you to trust me. And she hung up. I was sitting next to him when it happened, and I watched his face go through about 5 different things in 4 seconds. He landed on scared. Not angry, scared, and I realized I was too. We started going over unannounced. The first unannounced visit, Diane met us at the door and didn't let us pass the entryway. She was cheerful in a way that was so deliberate it made my skin crawl. She said Marcus was upstairs resting, that she'd been meaning to call, that we should do dinner next Friday. She talked without stopping for almost 4 minutes. And I counted because I was trying to find a gap to say something through. Daniel finally just said, Mom, what is going on in that room? She stopped talking. Then she had told you. Storage. I said, Diane, we can hear it moving. She looked at me, and for just a second, not long, maybe 2 seconds, her face cracked. Not into tears, not into anger, into something that looked like exhaustion. Like a person who has been holding a weight for a very long time and felt for just a moment the strain of it. Then she reset, smiled, said we were being dramatic and that she'd call us about Friday. Driving home, I said to Daniel, she's protecting something. He said, or someone. I started paying attention differently after that. I'm a project manager at an architecture firm. I spend a lot of my days tracking timelines, noticing when things don't add up, finding the discrepancy in the schedule that everyone else walked past. I turned that brain on Diane's life and started looking at the edges. I asked Patrice if she'd noticed any cars she didn't recognize. She had. A silver Honda Civic that was sometimes parked in front of the house, sometimes not. She didn't know whose it was. Not Marcus's, whose car was a newer Subaru. I mentioned to Daniel that we should check if Diane had made any large withdrawals recently. He didn't love the idea. I said, Daniel, I'm not trying to be controlling. I'm worried about your mother. He thought about it for a day and then called the bank, which he was authorized to do as a secondary contact on one of her accounts. Nothing unusual, normal spending. That was the thing. Everything was normal. Groceries, utilities, the book subscription she'd had for years, a few restaurant charges, nothing that pointed at anything. And yet, the room was still locked and something was still in it, and Diane had hung up on her son. One evening, I pulled up Marcus's name and started just looking. There wasn't a lot. A website for watercolor classes, a basic social media presence, some old photos from before Illinois where he'd apparently been living in Colorado. Nothing alarming, no red flags in the advice sense, but nothing that felt fully real either, like a profile that had been assembled carefully rather than lived into. I didn't know what to do with that, so I wrote it down and kept going. It was a Thursday night, 6 weeks after the wedding, when everything came apart. Daniel's phone rang at 11:40 p.m. It was Diane's number, but when he answered, it wasn't Diane's voice. It was a woman's voice, younger, and she was crying so hard the words were barely words. He could make out his mother's name, and the address and please, and I can't, and then the call dropped. We were in the car in 4 minutes. Daniel drove and I sat in the passenger seat with my phone, trying to call back, getting voicemail. I called Patrice and told her to go over now and wait outside if she got there first. Then I just held onto the door handle and watched the highway. 22 minutes from our house to Diane's. I have never felt the length of a drive like that. Patrice was already there when we arrived, standing on the porch with her arms crossed, looking shaken. She said she'd heard crying from the second floor when she got to the door. Daniel didn't ring the bell, he had a key. He let us in and went straight for the stairs, and I was right behind him. The hall was dark, except for the light coming from under the door at the end. The guest room. We could hear it now clearly. Not the low rhythmic sound from before, but something raw and desperate, someone crying behind a door they hadn't opened in 6 weeks. Daniel knocked. Mom? Nothing. Mom, open the door. It's me. A long pause. Then Diane's voice. Daniel, go home. I'm not going home. Another crying sound had stopped. He knocked again. Harder. Mom, I need you to open this door right now, or I'm opening it myself. Silence. He took a step back and put his shoulder into the door. Once, twice, and on the third it gave. He'd broken it that way once before, years ago, playing with his friends. He knew the house. The room was dim, lit by a lamp in the corner. There was a hospital bed that hadn't been there before, taking up most of the space where Daniel's old furniture used to be. There were medical supplies on the dresser, a small monitor with numbers on it, an IV stand. Diane was sitting in the chair next to the bed, and in the bed was a woman. She was young, maybe 25, maybe younger. It was hard to tell with the illness on her face. She had dark hair that had been recently brushed, braided over one shoulder. She was looking at us with eyes that were afraid and exhausted in equal measure. Daniel said, Mom. Diane didn't say anything for a moment. She just looked at her son, like she'd been waiting for this, and dreading it at the same time. Then she said, This is Sophia. She's Marcus's little sister. It took a long time for everything to come out. We sat in that room, all 4 of us, Patrice eventually in the doorway, and Diane talked for the first time in 6 weeks, like she was letting air out of something. Sophia was 23. She had ovarian cancer, diagnosed 14 months ago, at a point that required aggressive treatment. She had no health insurance. Marcus, who'd been in Colorado when it happened, had moved back to Illinois to be near her. She was staying with a friend at first, then not. The situation had become what the medical bills had made it. Marcus had met Diane in that watercolor class, not by accident. He'd been teaching it for income while trying to figure out what to do. They had genuinely fallen in love, or something like it, or at least something real enough that Diane said it without flinching when she told us. But they had also, she admitted, made a plan together. If Diane and Marcus were married, Sophia could potentially be added to Diane's health coverage as a dependent family member in certain circumstances, or at least their combined paperwork would give them more options to fight the insurance denials. The marriage was not fake. Diane was clear about that. It was not a scheme, and Marcus was not a predator, and she needed us to understand that before anything else. But it was also not something she'd told her children about. And that was where everything had broken. Daniel sat with that for a very long time. I could see him going through it, testing each piece of it, looking for the lie and not quite finding it because the lie wasn't in what she'd said. It was in what she'd kept from them for 6 weeks, in a locked room with an IV stand and a monitor and their mother sitting alone with it every night. He finally says, Ed, why didn't you just tell us? Diane was quiet. Then she said, because I knew you'd try to stop it, or fix it, and I needed to handle it my own way. Rebecca, when Daniel called her that night and she arrived at midnight with red eyes, and her hair still messy from being woken up, said almost the same thing as Daniel. Why didn't you just tell us? And Diane gave the same answer. And sitting there, I understood it and I didn't understand it. Diane was 64 years old and had raised 2 children alone after their father died when Daniel was 12. She had managed hospitals, managed crises, managed the particular kind of loneliness that builds up quietly over decades, when you are the person everyone else relies on. She'd been the one who handled things, for 30 years. And somewhere in that 30 years, she had stopped knowing how to let other people help. So when this came, she handled it, the way she'd always handled everything, alone. Sophia looked at us from the bed and said, I told Marcus you would find out. I told him it would be worse this way. Her voice was steady. Surprisingly steady for someone who'd been crying 40 minutes ago and had an IV in her arm. She had the kind of composure that I would come to learn was just her, a quality she'd apparently developed across 14 months of appointments and procedures and watching her brother try to hold everything together. She said, I'm sorry for the position this put your family in. Daniel looked at her for a moment. Then he said, You don't need to apologize for being sick. I don't know if he knew how much those words changed the room, but they did. Marcus came home around 1 in the morning. He'd been at a late class. He was still teaching, still working, still contributing to the household finances as best he could. He walked in to find half a family assembled in the guest room around his wife and his sister, and he stopped in the doorway and went very still. He looked at Diane first. She nodded. Like, yes, I told them. Yes, it's done. It's okay. He looked at Daniel, a long look, the kind of look that is asking a question that is too important to put into words. Daniel said, "What does she need?" And Marcus exhaled for maybe the first time in months, and sat down on the edge of his sister's bed and put his face in his hands for a moment. Just a moment. Then he pulled himself together and started talking. Sophia needed 2 more rounds of chemotherapy. The treatment plan her oncologist had recommended was aggressive and had a better-than-average prognosis at her stage, but it required consistency, and consistency required not moving her every 3 weeks when money ran out. It required stability. A bed. A roof. Monitoring. Someone to sit with her during the nights when the nausea was bad enough that she couldn't be alone. That was where the nights came from. The sounds, through the walls. Not screaming. Crying. Sophia, during the hard nights, and Diane sitting with her through all of them. I thought about the 6 weeks of Diane coming to the door breathless and slightly disheveled and talking too fast and not letting us past the entryway. And I reread all of it differently. Not a woman hiding a scheme. A woman who hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night in 6 weeks and was running on the specific fuel of someone who has decided they will handle this, they will get through this, they will not ask for help. Daniel called Rebecca into the hallway around 2 a.m. I could hear their voices, not the words. 15 minutes. Then they came back and Daniel said to Marcus, "We need to get Sophia added to Mom's insurance plan officially. Rebecca's going to look at what that requires," Rebecca said. "And we're going to talk about a formal agreement. Not because we don't trust you. Because it protects everyone, including you and my mother." Marcus nodded. He said, "I should have pushed her harder to tell you from the beginning." He said it to Daniel directly. "I knew it was the wrong call. I let her convince me." Diane, from her chair, said, "It was my decision. Don't put that on him." The next few months were not easy, but they were real in a way that the 6 weeks of silence hadn't been. Rebecca worked through the insurance situation with the precision of someone who has spent 15 years knowing which words to use and where to put them. Sophia was added as a dependent within 30 days. The paperwork was not simple, and I won't pretend it was, but it happened. The chemotherapy continued. Some weeks were harder than others. There were nights I drove to Diane's house because Marcus needed someone to sit with Sophia while he slept, and I sat there in the dim room with her while she watched whatever show she'd gotten into, on the tablet, propped against her knees, and she was funny. Unexpectedly, quietly funny. She made dry observations about the medical system, about her brother's cooking, about the particular awfulness of hospital gowns. She was easy to sit with in a way I hadn't expected. Diane and Marcus were, whatever they were, different from what any of us would have chosen or predicted, but not false. I watched them together enough times to know that. There was something between them that had grown out of an extraordinary and impractical set of circumstances. But it had grown, and it was there. Daniel took longer than I did to arrive at something like acceptance. He went through a period of coolness with Marcus that I understood, but that I also quietly hoped would pass. It did pass. Slowly. The way things pass when you watch a person show up, again and again, and do what they said they would do. The locked door was fixed about 3 weeks after Daniel broke it. A handyman came and replaced the handle and the frame, and everything went back to working order. But Sophia kept the room. We all just started leaving it open. She was 3 months into her final treatment round when she started sleeping through the nights without the monitor. 5 months in, her numbers were good enough that her oncologist used the word responding, and then a month after that used a different word, a better one. A word that made Marcus sit down in the hallway outside the exam room and not get up for a few minutes. He called Daniel from that hallway. I don't know what he said. I know that Daniel, when he came home that evening, was quieter than usual, but not in a heavy way. In a way that had some weight lifted out of it. At Thanksgiving, the first one we all spent together, crowded into Diane's dining room, with Patrice and her husband, and Rebecca and her fiancé and Sophia sitting at the table in regular clothes, not pajamas, eating actual food and complaining that Diane's stuffing needed more sage. Daniel leaned over to me during dessert and said, quietly, into my ear, "I still think she should have told us." I said, "She should have. She really should have." He said, "But I understand why she didn't." I said, "Yeah, Me too. There's something that happens in families, I think, when a secret finally surfaces. The secret itself is rarely the whole problem. The problem is everything that built up around it. The locked doors, the half-truths, the exhausted face at the threshold saying, "I've got this, please go home." The problem is the loneliness of thinking you have to carry the hard things by yourself, and the particular kind of pride that tells you asking for help is the same as failing. Diane didn't fail. She did something remarkable, actually, for a person she loved. She was just so used to doing things alone that she didn't know how to let anyone do it with her. I don't think she knows yet how to let people in, fully. I don't think that changes overnight after 30 years of being the person who handles it. But she tries now. She calls before things become emergencies. Last month, she called me just to say she was overwhelmed and didn't know what to do about the furnace. And I came over, and we figured it out together. And she said thank you in this small, stiff way. Like the words were ones she was still getting used to using. That felt like something. Sophia moved into her own apartment in April. A one-bedroom in Evanston, close enough to the hospital for follow-up appointments, and close enough to us for Sunday dinners. She brought a plant. She got a job. She started a watercolor class. Not her brother's, a different one she'd found herself. She texted me a photo of her first finished piece. It was nothing fancy, a lake scene, a little uneven. But it was hers, and she'd made it, and she was still here to make it. I pinned it to the corkboard in my office, where I keep the things I want to remember. Some of them I look at when the days are hard. That one I look at when I want to remember what it looks like, when something pulls through.